Okay, good morning. We're here for a meeting of the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. It's Wednesday, December 9th, and we are discussing transportation and master planning. And we have joining us Department of Transportation, Park and Planning. And let's get started. Glenn Orland has prepared a packet.
Okay. I'll just get a couple opening comments, then turn it over to the planning staff. These recommendations, 5.11 through 5.15, were in the County Growth Policy Report draft that the Planning Board sent over in August. The PHED committee decided not to take them up during the course of the SSP deliberations because they really weren't part of the SSP resolution. So with everything else you had to do with all the other meetings, this could be put a little bit on the back burner. However, we do need to have the council give some guidance to the planning board on this today or very soon, because they are developing master plans which are which will rely upon this kind of guidance as we speak. So the way this morning I thought would go is I would turn over now to the planning staff. They'll go through the PowerPoint that's in the packet, and then turn to Gary Ehrenrich and DOT, who will talk about their comments. Then I'll talk about mine and then open up for discussion. Okay. So unless there's any other introductions, I just turn it over to maybe to Eric or to Alex Rixey, who's the consultant with Fair and Peers, who work with planning staff.
Is that the right how you want to proceed? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, glad we could come back to this quickly, and this was an important topic. So planning has put a lot of effort into thinking through a new approach, and let's get their presentation.
Sure. So this is Eric Gray with the planning department, and Alex, if you could pull up the PowerPoint and share that so we can get started. Thank you. And Alex, you can go on to the next slide, please, if you could. Just as a way of quick introduction, this is Eric Gray with the planning department, and I'm joined by Alex Rixey from Fair and Peers, DC, Fair and Peers, and also they work collaboratively with a tool design in support of the SSP update work that we've done over the past several months. But we're here to talk today about policy area review for transportation review for master plans. And the graphic that you see before you are the current configuration of the master plans we have as a result of the adoption of the GIP this past month. And the point here is that we're talking about transportation from an area-wide perspective, not a local perspective. And the policy areas that you see here do vary in size, but we're talking about being able to evaluate adequacy at an area-wide level rather than at a local level. Next slide. Currently, well, let me back up. Typically and historically, we've had a two-tier transportation adequacy test that was a part of the growth policy or the SSP. There was a local area transportation review test and also an area-wide test. But in the last update of the SSP, well, the prior update of the SSP in 2016-2020, for the 2016-2020 SSP, the policy area adequacy test was eliminated. And so by default, that left us only with an LATR test to look at and to provide guidance in terms of how we evaluated master plans. And by default, that meant looking at the motor vehicle adequacy test to evaluate master plans. So the proposed approach we're contemplating today is that it would apply only to looking at master plan or sector plan review. It would also, and I think this is really a big deal, it would remove level of service as a policy area level metric. And this is significant because one of the major recommendations that was implemented as part of the GIP was to eliminate the motor vehicle test in the red policy areas. So if we've done it for subdivision review, why would we continue to do it for master plans? Also, the proposed approach would not apply in the green policy areas. We think those should be exempt. And we think that the metrics that we're talking about using really is much more progressive than the current paradigm, and it would really reflect increased the increased value of alternative travel modes, and it will also consider the effects of policy changes area-wide and also across Montgomery County. Next slide. Now, we're really talking about metrics that are basically in two categories. One is accessibility, and another category looks at mobility and environment. In terms of accessibility, there are two metrics that we're going to be talking about in detail, and they really address a variety of modes: auto, transit, bike, and I think, and you see a check for walk. Right now, we really don't have metrics that really deal in a robust fashion for walk modes, but we think that's something that the tools that we're proposing could address sometime in the future. In terms of mobility and environment, we're looking at three metrics: travel times for auto and transit, VMT per capita, and also non-auto driver mode share. And they do address metrics depending upon, and modes are addressed depending upon the metrics that are selected for application. So what we're talking about now is really having a toolbox of metrics that we could apply to master plans, either all of them or some subset. So as we continue on with the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Alex, and he can talk about the details of the metrics that we're proposing today. Alex.
Thanks, Eric. So this slide just shows, Eric had the slide that gives a higher level summary, and this breaks out each of the individual metrics that are recommended. As Eric mentioned, the first one, accessibility, first looking at accessibility by auto and by transit. So the measure for each is the number of jobs that can be reached within 45 minutes by auto, and then separately the number of jobs that can be reached within 45 minutes by transit. And for all of these metrics, the standard is that the master plan must maintain or improve the value of the metric countywide. So in the case of job accessibility, it must maintain or improve the average accessibility for the county as a whole, the effects of the changes to the particular master plan on the county as a whole. And then we've calculated threshold values for each of these that are based on the currently adopted master plans and transportation network that are reflected in the travel form model. So the next metric is travel times. So still looking at performance for automobiles, but less, as Eric was describing, less targeted to individual locations and more holistic in terms of the times that it will take to make trips in the master plan area and throughout the county. So this is the average time by auto and the average time by transit for all purposes at all times. And we've calculated threshold values there. The next metric, vehicle miles traveled per capita. That's the total amount of travel by vehicles in the county per person in the county, and that per person value includes both residents and employees. And again, the threshold is to maintain or improve the average as a whole based on the current plans. The next metric, non-auto driver mode share, is the percent of non-auto driver mode share for all weekday trips regardless of trip purpose. So this includes both commute trips and all other trip purposes and other times of day, as is currently recommended. Non-auto drivers, I think everyone is probably familiar with that concept, but this includes passengers in high-occupancy vehicle trips as well as transit, walk, and bike travel. And then the final metric is low-stress bicycle accessibility, calculated as the percentage of the potential bicycle trips that can be accommodated on low-stress bikeways. And those low-stress bikeways are calculated using the level of traffic stress methodology. The threshold there is 80% of trips would be accommodated on a low-stress bikeway at the build-out of the bicycle master plan. So that's a high-level overview. I'll go into each of the metrics in a little bit more detail now. So the first one, again, auto and transit accessibility. There's a map in the bottom left corner that shows the baseline values for 2050. And again, this is the idea that we're calculating the number of jobs that are accessible within 45 minutes from each of the transportation analysis zones, and then averaging that effect up to the whole county. So you can see the effects that an individual master plan, changes to an individual master plan would have on the value for the county holistically.
Okay, wait, I'm sure we'll talk through each of these as we go.
Sure.
You said, does it have to improve the accessibility of all the zones or of the master plan the area of the master plan?
That's a good question. So what we're recommending currently is that it actually has to improve the accessibility for the county on average. So you could improve the accessibility of a particular zone within the master plan area, could improve the entire master plan area, or could be making improvements that would improve accessibility throughout the county.
Okay, well, I guess that's the crux of the one disagreement that council staff has highlighted for us, but I didn't mean to jump to that. I was really just trying to ask some questions to better understand it. Help me understand the logical issue here. If we were to do a master plan, let's say in Clarksburg, and say the plan says we're going to have, a large job base. I'm getting an echo. I don't know if I noticed something on both phone and other. Okay. Then that would improve the accessibility of the county, of that area and of the whole county to jobs. However, it might not match market reality, at this time. Maybe this is just something I don't need to worry about, because as we adopt every master plan, we would think about those issues and whether we're being realistic about a master plan area. But help me understand, what guards against, putting together unrealistic plans and then saying, well, they increase the job accessibility of the county, and so it meets the test.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you're hitting at the crux of the issue. So the reason that we're interested in looking at the effects on the entire county as a whole is that if you're looking at each of these master plans in isolation, it's true that if you hold everything else in the county equal and then make improvements to a particular master plan area, that will inherently improve the average for the county. But I think the idea behind the more holistic measure is to also be thinking comprehensively about the effects of that master plan on other areas of the county. So if a master plan is modified to, as you're describing, increase the amount of employment there, it's important to keep in mind the effects that could have on employment levels in other master plans planned for the same time horizon in the rest of the county. And so improving transit accessibility to job, for example, in Clarksburg, if it's possible to increase the number of jobs there while still maintaining the number of jobs elsewhere in the county, that makes a lot of sense, and you would then be improving the outcome for the rest of the county. But if the number of jobs added to Clarksburg come at the expense of jobs in another location, that could have a counterbalancing effect.
We don't really create jobs. Like, all we do is sort of allow zoning, so how do you put those two together? Sort of struggling to articulate myself here, but we have a lot of master plans that call for jobs that have never arrived, because that's just not the way the market is working these days. Is that a concern in this model, or how do you address that as a practical matter through this model?
Well, I don't think there's really a real hard and fast way of addressing that. I think one thing that you're really hostage to the assumptions in the model. So if you have a zoning recommendation that would allow for a certain amount of jobs, that's the assumption that is reflected in the model. And so you're really a hostage to the assumptions that you make. And so there's really no way of getting around it. You can test different zoning options and look at and sort of do some scenario analysis in that regard. But other than that, you're hostage to your assumptions.
Yeah, maybe one other illustration of the reason for looking countywide is more from a transportation perspective. So on this slide, thanks for bringing up the Clarksburg example. If for example, the Clarksburg plan were not improving the jobs accessibility by transit, one of the potential policy responses could be to add new transit service that would connect the new residents to newer existing jobs. And there, you can imagine two ways to go about doing that. You could be connecting residents within the Clarksburg area to jobs specifically within the Clarksburg area that could improve the accessibility in the Clarksburg area. You could also imagine, running transit from Clarksburg to other areas that already have a lot of jobs, and it's possible that that approach could increase the jobs accessibility even more, or vice versa. Could be bringing, maybe Clarksburg's not a good example there, but could be bringing commuters from other areas to the target master plan area. And the idea behind looking at the entire county is that we're not just focused on improving the Clarksburg outcome based on changes we're making in Clarksburg, but looking to improve the county-wide outcome based on changes we're making in Clarksburg.
Yeah, so, I appreciate this, just the same kind of line of questioning, a couple things. One, obviously when we're looking at transportation adequacy, we should be looking at it regionally or countywide, or, with the broadest possible context, because that's how transportation works. It would be looking like, we don't want to look at a single drop of water when we're talking about a river, or an ocean. I mean, that's how it all works. The water goes in all different directions. So we shouldn't just be looking at one small area, because that's not how, travel patterns work. I do question, how we define access to a job. I mean, to Councilmember Reamer, to the chair's point, saying that it could create up to a certain amount of jobs and actually having a job that's there are two very different things. And I do think that, master plans are ambitious documents of what we hope to happen, not necessarily what has or will happen. And so I think that is a bit of a question. To me, I think it's, the biggest piece of it is how you define the access to the job. Like what is a job? If the job is what the master plan assumes, I guess the question would be, are there other ways of looking at that? Like, is it access to an activity center, or how many, I don't know the answer. But anyway, that would be, that would be my challenge. I get the idea of wanting to have a countywide comprehensive approach and wanting to have it be a net positive as opposed to a net negative or even a neutral. I think the question is, how do you define what that is? And then the last thing, it's clear to me that this is trying to solve a problem that's been created by changes. I'm still having trouble a little bit understanding specifically what problem does this whole thing solve? Like, if we take it back and say, okay, here is the public policy issue that we face, and here's what we are putting in place in order to solve it. Like, I understand moving in the direction where this is being recommended and why that's an improvement and helps to fix some of the challenges based on some of the recent changes that have occurred. It's not totally clear to me how this is, if you started from scratch, that this would be the public policy solution to a public policy problem, and what exactly that is.
Well, I think right now in the current paradigm, we're completely reliant on the motor vehicle adequacy test in the LATR to look at how we evaluate master plans. And so that is what we're trying to move away from.
Yeah, no, and this is what I'm saying. I agree with that. I agree with the fact that we had something that isn't working based on our current goals and needs, and you're putting this up as an improvement to that status quo that doesn't meet our public policy goals and needs. What I'm wondering and questioning is whether or not, if you took that part away and said, does this solve the problem? Is there a problem we're trying to solve? And does this solve the problem in the best way that we could? And that's what I'm not particularly clear on. Like, I agree with the recommendation and the goal of what it's attempting to do. I'm just unclear as to whether or not it wouldn't make sense to eliminate it and come up with something new and different, or maybe not come up with anything at all. I mean, I think we're forcing an answer to a problem. It seems to me that would be my. If someone could explain to me why that is not the case, that this is a good solution, and if we were starting from scratch, we would do something like this, and it does meet our public policy objectives, and it does solve problems, then that would be.
Could I jump in on this? In a sense, this is brand new. This is looking at the idea entirely differently than we have done before. And so in the packet, I talk about why we even look at master plan adequacy. And it really had to do with whether or not when you're creating a plan for an area like a Clarksburg or an Olney or wherever, that you make sure that the transportation services and projects that are in that plan, and by the plan, we're talking about 25, 30, 40 years from now. Okay, we're not talking about now. How is that in sync with the land use that's also being proposed in the plan? Otherwise, you don't have a balanced plan. And in the past, what we've done is we've used the same test, as Eric mentioned, we use the same test when we do the analysis at the master plan level as we used for subdivisions. The difference being instead of 6 years out for subdivisions, we look at build out. So 25, 30, 35 years out. We do the comparison there. And as Eric pointed out, with the changes that the council made with the GIP, you no longer measure congestion in the red areas, at least. That's congestion can go wherever it goes. In the orange and yellow areas, there are still tests, motor vehicle tests, the intersection tests. But the idea is that, again, based on the prioritization you gave, you'd rather see improvements being done in the way of TDM and operational improvements, and only as a last resort doing intersection improvements or other kinds of road improvements. And so it didn't seem to make sense anymore to use that same set of comparisons for the master plan analysis. So it leaves a void. And it gets to your question, do we approve master plans, the transportation elements of master plans without looking at all at whether or not it's in sync in one way, shape, or another with the land use that's being proposed, or do you? And this is the planning board's proposals into how to do that. And we'll talk more about the specifics of these when DOT and then I'll give my specific comments. But I think that's the point of this exercise. And to Mr. Reamer's comment, worrying about is this going to match up with what the demand is for office space or anything else? Well, the demand for office space now or for non-residential is pretty low now and has been actually for several years. It isn't necessarily going to stay that way for the next 25 or 30 years. And the question whether it's office space or some other kind of commercial development, the ratio of housing to jobs is still pretty important in terms to trying to get some balance within each of these policy areas to the degree that makes sense to do that. So I try to not think of this in terms of what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years. Think more in terms of what would happen in the next, 35 to 40 years. I guess my comment on that.
Well, I understand that, but if you look at some of the master plans, they don't happen in 30 to 40 years either. Sometimes it just doesn't pan out. I mean, and so
well, we haven't gotten there yet, so yeah. We'll see. But I understand your point. It's hard to think in such long terms, but that's really what this is. Because you're right.
But if we go back to 1,000 feet, I just to clarify my question. Your point is we need to have something that balances the land use and the transportation to make sure that it's in balance. The question is, what does that even mean, and how do we do that? And this is the proposal in order to
right.
that out.
And that's right.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
If it's okay, just to add something to the conversation, I appreciate it.
Sure, Gary.
That's the thrust of our comments, of DOT's comments, is that it's the lens that you're looking at to calculate the performance measure. We generally agree that these are the right metrics. We just don't think that what's being proposed by the planning board is a general plan type of scope and review, not a master plan. And it requires more measures that you actually can distinguish and determine the differences. For instance, it is almost impossible to have a significant change in almost all of these metrics at a county-wide level with one master plan. even Bethesda will not change significantly a county-wide number or average. It just can't happen. It's too small. Things like the purple line barely change a county-wide number in terms of transit mode share. So what we were proposing later on in the packet is, let's just look at whether there's a change at the master plan level, which is positive. And each of these indicators, there is a positive move and a negative move. And if it's a positive move, then it's meeting our goals and showing that we're in conformance to the overall goals of environment, transportation, and land use. So that's why we think the metrics are kind of right, but let's just make sure under this one, under transit accessibility that's on the screen, that we just have more jobs that are accessible within 45 minutes than with the base. And the question then comes in, how much more accessible how many more jobs do you need? And that's still an open question from our perspective. We haven't done enough analysis to be able to tell you that. So we think the metrics are important and meaningful, but they can't be measured countywide because it's almost impossible to see a significant change in the number with a master plan.
We'll get into that in due course here. Thank you, Gary. All right, let's keep going through the presentation. Sorry.
All right, no, that's all right. This is good discussion. So the next metric is auto and transit travel times. So this is looking at the average travel time per trip for all trips. And the threshold again is that's less than the future baseline that's established. And this includes all trips and all times of day. So it's a pretty straightforward one, but again is using the TAZ level trips from each TAZ to each TAZ, calculating the average travel time that it takes to make that trip. And then again here, to the previous discussion, looking at currently at the countywide average, although this could be adjusted to look at other pairs of trips.
You have a map of these TAZs? Where are they?
This is sorry, it's kind of small, but this is the level of granularity. They're the same TAZs as for the transit accessibility calculation or the auto accessibility calculation.
Do they match they don't match master plan boundaries, right? How are they devised?
They do not precisely match the master plan boundaries.
This is the TAZs. They do change periodically. In fact, with the new Forest Glen plan, with the new boundary, the TAZs will be revised. But essentially, the TAZs is the smallest area from which the transportation model works off of. All the trips come in and out of individual traffic analysis zones. And so there may be in a policy area, depending how big it is, it could be as few as 2 or 3 TAZs. In a large one, it could be 10 or 15. But it's a way of allowing the travel model to work to figure out where trips are coming from and going to. Eric probably has a map somewhere. I don't think he could probably pull it up now, but we can get you a copy of what those TAZs are.
I'm blissfully ignorant of but I'm glad for that explanation.
Actually, here you go for homework if you want to do this. If you go back and look at the 2016 to 2020 SSP, just go find the resolution in was the council's resolution. Half of that SSP resolution are maps showing the boundaries for each of the policy areas. Back then, we showed the TAZs within each of those boundaries, so you'll see them. So you'll see them there. We decided not to do it this time around because it was sort of extraneous information, and so it sort of junked up the maps. So in the GIP resolution, you don't see them anymore. But to see where they were, go back to the 2016 one, and you'll see it.
But the point is, TAZs are not something that we do in our council work. We don't work according to those. These are components of a transportation model that you run everything through. That's what they are.
That's correct. Yes, that's right.
Got it. Okay. keep going.
Okay. So just a few clarifications on the transit travel time piece of this. The auto, I think, is fairly straightforward. The model includes some provisions for how long it takes to find parking at your origin and destination, and then the travel time in the car. But for transit, this also includes the time spent in the transit vehicle, the time spent waiting at the transit stop, the time spent waiting to transfer, if there is a transfer from one transit mode to another, and then the access time to either walk or drive to transit, and the model estimates the number of people who are accessing transit by those different approaches. There have also been some questions previously about why transit travel times might be increasing in the future, even though we're making substantial investments in transit infrastructure. And some of the reasons for that are the new connections that are being provided. So this metric is based on all of the travel that's being made by transit and not direct apples to apples looking at individual transit trips. So it's possible that people could be spending longer traveling by transit because they now have access to new origins and destinations that they did not before, or are choosing to take trips on transit that might have previously been made by auto that are longer distance trips. Congestion in mixed traffic when buses are operating in mixed traffic could also increase the times. And then there's the effect of just the overall travel demand patterns if land use becomes more distributed and origins and destinations are farther apart, that would also increase travel times. So then the question of how transit travel times could be reduced. Potential policy responses include further improving the transit performance, whether that's through BRT or dedicated facilities, improving headways to reduce the wait times, increasing opportunities to shorten the travel distances, so that could be better balancing land uses so that people are able to complete their trips at a shorter distance, adding more local transit routes to connect to more destinations nearby, and then locating future land use growth in areas that have high transit accessibility and relatively short travel times. Any other questions on the auto and transit travel time metrics?
No. I remember working on this broad framework in 2016. So it's interesting to see it back before us. Okay.
All right, then the next metric is vehicle miles traveled per capita. So this is the total amount of daily vehicle miles traveled divided by what we're calling service population, so the sum of population and employment, essentially all the residents and workers who are served by that travel. And again, this is calculated by the travel form model. And this might be getting a little bit in the weeds, but the travel includes, for any given area, all of the travel that's completely within the area. This is just sort of an accounting process. And then half of the travel that is entering the area from another area, half of the travel that's going from the target area to another area, and it does not include through trips. So trips that are just passing through are not included. So this is really the vehicle miles of travel that are attributed to land uses in a particular area, either starting or ending there, or both. Are there any questions about that metric or approach? Oops, sorry, that line didn't come up.
Nope, BMT.
Okay. The next metric is non-auto driver mode share. And this is, as currently proposed, the percent of non-auto driver trips that are made for all trip purposes at all times of day. And again, the threshold is improving that over the future baseline conditions.
Okay, let's, so the proposed metric, so the metric is it just for, you measure the plan area and, yeah, it's a policy area. So you're measuring the policy area and ADMS.
That's right.
Okay. All right, keep going.
Okay. And then the final metric is the bicycle accessibility metric. And this is the percentage of potential bicycle trips that are able to be made on a low stress network. And that low stress definition is based on the planning department's calculation of appropriate for most adults or appropriate for most children. So these are low stress bicycle facilities. And again, the current recommendation is at the countywide level, and it's based on the estimated number of bicycling trips that would be made across origins and destinations. Level of traffic stress is also a sort of weakest link all or nothing metric. So in order for a trip to qualify for this, it needs to be able to be completely made on a low stress facility.
Okay.
And this is the information from the bicycle master plan, showing the percent of trips in that plan that if the plan is completely built out, would expect that 80% of bicycle trips would be able to be made on a low stress facility. And so that's the threshold for this metric.
That's a hard threshold to meet, I think. Isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's based on the assumption that the land uses are built out in the way that are anticipated and that the entire bicycle master plan is built out as planned.
That's a very long-term project. Yeah.
Yeah, for the record, this is Jason Sartori with the Planning Department. Just to clarify that again, what this is, this says, as Alex just mentioned, if everything in the bicycle master plan and every other master plan that's come since gets implemented, then that is our baseline. That is what we will achieve. That's not to say that we're at 80% right now, or that we'll be at 80% in a certain time frame. That's just at build out of our master plans. That's what we will achieve. So any other master plan that we propose going forward, we're saying needs to at least ensure that we maintain that 80% or better going forward. We don't want to approve a new master plan that might change that future baseline to something like 73% or something, because it somehow adds a bunch of facilities that are not safe in terms of bicycle accessibility. So,
okay, so this is somewhat static in a sense because the master plan has been adopted and it is what
right.
it is.
Yeah, we're at 80% now. We're not at 80% in terms of actual safety. In terms of our roads currently, 80% of our roads meeting that, or of our trips meeting that. But if our master plans are built out, then we would achieve that 80% today.
Gotcha.
Does that complete the presentation from the planning staff?
I think we're done. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Next, we're going to hear from DOT, but Gary basically gave his comment, which, if I can summarize, is basically, at least for the first three issues, the VMT, the accessibility, and the travel times, that you look for improvement within the planning area that's for which you're doing the master plan, as opposed to county as a whole. Now, in reality, an improvement in a master plan area will mean that there will be an improvement in the county as a whole, just by by logic. But from a presentational standpoint, I agree with DOT that I think it's better to do it based on the planning area, because at least you can then see some kind of measurable improvement, even if it's only a couple percent. If it's on a countywide basis, you're talking about a fraction of a percent, and it's probably just not very useful in that regard. It might be, looking countywide might be a more useful thing to look at when you're doing Thrive, looking at countywide, general plan update, but for a master plan area. I would agree with DOT. And furthermore, I didn't say this in the packet, but if we're talking about a sector plan area, something that's a very small area like Clarksburg, I'll be picking on Clarksburg. Let's say there was a sector plan change for the Clarksburg Town Center policy area. It probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do these metrics just based on the town center. Maybe looking at all of the Clarksburg planning area for that metric may make more sense as well.
Let's see. All right. So this is the issue, right? Let's hear.
It's one of the issues. I have several others, but this is one.
Okay. So let's hear from planning as to why they recommended we focus on the policy area rather than countywide. Eric, I guess that goes to you because it's either you or Alex.
I think that we thought that it was an approach that made sense in terms of, frankly, we were looking at what the analysis were done in support of Thrive. We thought that following that same approach seemed to make sense for the GIP or the growth policy as well. Having said that, I think that applying this metric at the policy, looking at this from a countywide perspective rather than just looking at it from the policy area perspective rather than the countywide perspective is something that we could support. I don't think we're not adverse to looking at it at the policy area level, but we certainly thought it could fly at the countywide level. So that's what we proposed.
Okay, I mean, I guess my question about it was, does that set an unrealistic, like if you do it at the countywide level, the way I read Glenn's explanation, development in urban areas is going to be able to meet that test because almost by definition, it's going to be moving the needle a little bit towards all of these accessible measures due to its location. And when you say it has to be in the area of the plan itself, you know, it becomes a little harder, but I'm not sure how hard. And since we're not using an LATR type set of criteria, we're using all these accessibility criteria, it may not be that hard for it to achieve those markers either. So can you just explain that? My original thought was that planning was seeking a way that would overall, you know, ensure that we're not putting up unrealistic barriers towards the urbanized pattern that we want. But I'm not hearing that was really actually a concern I need to worry about. So I want to hear from planning as to why they recommended it the way that they did.
If I can make one clarification and just want to make sure that that's clear in the presentation, that it's each master plan area is not expected to achieve the same level of a particular metric. So the standard for Clarksburg is not the same as the standard for Bethesda. But each master plan area needs to achieve the future baseline level or improve it such that the overall county is on the trajectory to meet the planned metric outcomes.
Therefore, does that mean therefore that the baseline is the average of all the county?
Yeah, that's right. That the countywide baseline is the countywide average, and that we're measuring all of the changes against its effect on that countywide average. Ultimately, it's kind of more of an analytical point than and maybe the messaging or the way that it's summarized for the public is different. But we will be doing the calculations either way at a TAZ level. It's just a question of how it's aggregated up.
But the county has maybe 20 million vehicle miles of travel a day. And if you're going to make some changes in one policy area that may be thousands of vehicle miles of travel, you're not going to change anything at the county-wide. Point is, it's a meaningless statistic and metric, the way it's being proposed. It doesn't help us with jobs housing balance. It doesn't help us with much that we're doing within the policy area that we're studying and testing. So it needs to be policy area focused on things that we can do in the policy area to improve the metric. So the MT per capita is pretty important, but you're not going to change the MT per capita countywide for 10,000, 20,000, a couple million square feet of development. It's just impossible because the base is too large to change. So why are we doing this? Why would we do the analysis if we're not going to be able to learn anything or change anything?
Okay. In fairness, I think it's hard. You can move it in a mathematical sense, and if you put all of them together, you could move it in a real sense. But I hear what you're saying. But is there a concern about making it focused in the policy area rather than countywide?
It sounds like Mr. Gray said he was okay with that. I thought, or
we're not adverse to that.
The only thing I would say is that we would need to consider some of the smaller policy areas and whether it should be expanded. So like the Burtonsville Town Center policy area is a really tiny policy area. And all of our red policy areas, they're pretty tiny. So as it relates directly to the Silver Spring and adjacent communities plan that we're doing right now, do we want to look beyond that very tight Silver Spring red policy area and look to the neighboring policy areas?
Well, in the growth policy, when we talked about it, we had a solution to this similar problem, and we used the abutting in red policy areas. Perhaps we can adopt almost exact, if not exact, language that is consistent with what we've otherwise done to solve the same issue.
Now, this is what I suggested a few minutes ago, which is if you're going to have a small sector plan area like Clarksburg or Burtonsville, you do your analysis not based on that small area, but based on the larger, the parent, if you will, policy area that it sits within. So in the case of Burtonsville, it would be the Fairlawn-Colesville policy area. In the case of Clarksburg Town Center, it would be Clarksburg policy area. In the case of Bethesda CBD, it would be the BCC policy area boundary, do the analysis within that. So I think that'd be the more appropriate place to do that.
Yeah, it could also be part of the scoping of that master plan. So when the council approves a master plan to be part of the planning department's work program, there could be direction given in terms of, the analysis should be reviewed at this particular scope, including, this policy area. And if it's maybe it could be on the edge of a policy area, of two policy areas. And so you could define the area that you want the review of these metrics to be done at as, the two policy areas or whatever it may be, whatever's appropriate for each one.
I think if we just have an understanding of that might be sufficient. I guess I worry about the hearing notice. Because if you were doing a Bethesda CBD plan, not that we need to do one again, I don't think immediately. But let's say Silver Spring CBD plan, which you're doing now. If you were to advertise the plan as being all of the Silver Spring Tacoma policy area, and that would open the question: Are we really looking at land use, in Montgomery Hills or in Long Branch or any of the other areas? So it might just be simpler just to have an understanding amongst everybody here that when the analysis is done, it's done that way.
I think by doing Bethesda Chevy Chase, I mean, you've created a large enough area that you've both satisfied the need to make it realistic, but also so that it's meaningful. I mean, I agree with DOT that, it's too big of an ocean with too little bit of water to make a difference. Use the thing I was talking about.
Okay.
Moving on to if we can move on to the next points. This is the bottom half of page 3. I just make the point at the beginning that, again, it just needs to be a recognition by the council that by going to these new metrics, there's no longer going to be a link, as we recognize, between the GIP test and the master plan test, which could result at some point in the long time future, that some developments that are trying to get through the LATR requirements may not be able to get there because we haven't developed a master plan which the subdivisions could nest into. But, I guess we'll deal with that when we get there. The second point is the one we just covered, which is that at least for the first 3 metrics, which are really 5 metrics, it's auto and transit accessibility, it's auto and transit travel time, and VMT, that they'll be looked at a policy area basis. And we made this further thought that if it's a small policy area, it would be for the parent policy areas where you do your analysis. The next point I want to point out has to do with the non-auto driver mode share.
Wait, Glenn, do we need to discuss these in person, or is there agreement? Is everybody in this?
Well, if you want to take them, if you want to just deal with those things that we just talked about and see if there's agreement amongst the council, amongst the committee, that would make sense. You're right. Okay. So I guess the main one being the one we just finished talking about, which is that the analysis be done at the policy area level, or if it's a small policy area, it would be in the parent policy area.
That one, I think we're all, yep. Leave my comments on.
Okay.
Yeah, the first one, the policy area. Yeah, right. The compromise we discussed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, a follow-up to that point, and I don't have, none of us could have a recommendation on this because it's just more information than we need. The planning board's recommendation for adequacy is that that the new plan do better than the old plan. But is that good enough? Do you want to have the planning board come up with some metrics like, well, no, it has to be 2% better or 5% better, or it could be different amounts of better for each of those 5 things I mentioned: the auto and transit accessibility, auto and transit travel time, and the VMT. I'm not prepared, and I don't think anybody on this call is prepared to make specific recommendations as to what it would be. But that's something I think that maybe the planning board staff could work on over the next, I don't know, next few months or whatever, and report back in terms of what would make sense. And it might vary by planning area. So for example, if you have a planning area where a master plan is being redone, and there's really only a couple sites where the land use is going to change, pretty much everything is settled, then the amount of change that can happen in that planning area is likely to be very, very small. So to say an arbitrary percentage increase is what needs to be met may not be meetable, obtainable. But on the other hand, a master plan area which still has a good bit of flexibility in it, in terms of the land use, it might make sense. So it's a complicated issue, but I'm just raising the point that is that something that you'd like to see the planning staff work on some more over time.
Tell you what, if you guys want to discuss this, I will be back in 45 seconds. I've got to
okay.
Go something.
Okay, well, we can take a pause.
Yeah, I mean,
Mr. Reamer, Mr. Joanna, do you want to just wait for like a minute?
Well, could you just state what you said again about?
Okay. So the adequacy measure. We just finished talking about how to measure adequacy, which was to look at the policy area wide. But what are we looking for? The planning board's recommending that it be that the new plan be better than the old plan. So if accessibility is X and under the old plan, then the accessibility has to be at least marginally better in the new plan. And I'm more raising the question: is that enough, or do you want to actually have guidance which says no, it has to be better by a certain amount?
There's no proposal right now for what those amounts would be.
Correct. And it would vary. I would think
at the end of this, besides giving direction, like what's the decision point? Like, are we voting? Are we formally approving this? Because I mean that would impact my feedback here.
Sure.
In terms of the timing of when this is going to be implemented, how it's going to be implemented, and what the formal decision point, if any, is this informal guidance? Is this a formal decision? What are we talking about?
That's a really good question. We didn't think that this would be something that necessarily had to go to the council, as long as there was some kind of agreement as to what would make sense. And maybe just the minutes of the meeting could do that. Or maybe it's a memo from the committee chair to the planning board saying, this is what we discussed in the committee, this is the guidance. They could take that form. And maybe that makes sense because it sort of memorializes it. And particularly if, for example, on this point I'm just now bringing up, if you want them to do some more work in this area, you could say that in the memo as well. Maybe that's the way of doing this, but we hadn't really thought through how, what this means. I don't think we need we sort of don't need any kind of a formal resolution, I don't think.
That's helpful. Just that was the kind of outstanding question that I had about this. So I don't feel strong about this. I'd like to hear what planning thinks on the specific metric related to improvement. I think on the one hand, metrics are obviously good. On the other hand, being too rigid could present more problems than it solves. And so,
right.
I don't do this work every day, so yield to them. But that would be my view on it. It's easier if we're not making a formal decision to me on this, because we could get feedback from planning later on this particular point if there's a way to do this that would be better. But if you think that it's just a bad idea that we can't do or shouldn't do, or you have real concerns, then that would be helpful too.
I would just say I think that we're primarily looking for guidance on this because we've got these plans that are underway right now, and as we go forward with them pretty early in these processes, we need to start these analyses. And in some cases, with what we do now, we have to contract with consultants to get the data that we need. And so this kind of, if we get that kind of guidance from you on this, it helps set us in the right direction for the master plans we're currently working on. And it may be as we go into it that we realize, okay, of these 5 metrics, and as Dr. Orland pointed out, a couple of them are actually 2 each, right? of these, we may find that certain ones are not applicable for certain master plans. And so the idea is that this is kind of like the tool set that from which we will pull the metrics that make the most sense, and that will be the information that we'll be providing to you for you to be able to evaluate these when they come before you. So I don't think we need a formal vote or need to go to the council. We just need to know that if we start working with these, you're not going to come back to us and say, what are these metrics? Why are we looking at these, not what we've done in the past? So,
can I suggest just to close the loop on this, a couple things. One is that we maybe do memorialize whatever the committee comes up with today in the form of a memo from the chair to maybe Ms. Wright or to Mr. Anderson. Secondly, that the memo wouldn't say anything about anything different with the planning board's recommending about what has to be reached. In other words, it's just a betterment. That's all that's required. But to maybe say that as you go through some of these plans, think about whether or not there might be specific improvements that could be required in the future. Because really, there's no way anybody can tell us right now. There are too many variables as to what that would be. But the last thing I want to push back a little bit on what Jason just said, and I heard the same from Eric in private conversation. I think whatever metrics you use ought to be used by all plans, because I don't think we should sort of pick and choose which ones make sense for one plan versus another. I think that makes sense for all plans, and if it doesn't meet the goal for a particular plan, a particular metric, then change the plan, because we think accessibility and transit and auto travel times and VMT are important, then they should be important for all plans. So I just needed to say that.
At the same time, is it feasible to have, is it appropriate to have a one size fits all set of goals, for every plan must achieve, like you said, 2% for vehicle,
no,
5%.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that whatever, in other words, you wouldn't decide to say, all right, we'll apply in Silver Spring the accessibility metric, but not the VMT metric. You still look at all of these different metrics. What you wouldn't have is standards for each of these metrics. You wouldn't say, oh, you have to do better than 2% better or 5% better. You just have to do better.
So it's the same metrics. It's not necessarily the same level of achievement of the metrics.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
All right.
Moving on, unless there's more discussion on this point, I think it's important to really pinpoint what we mean by non-auto driver mode share. The meaning of it in current master plans and in the JIP that you just approved is non-auto drive share for the work trip. And in the TDM regime that the DOT has been working on forever, and under the new law, it's the work trip. And so I think it's a bit confusing to basically have a measure which looks at NADMS for all trips, particularly that includes trips in the middle of the evening or in the middle of the day, when the amount of travel isn't all that important in terms of how the system works.
And I also want to know how you do it too.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. The base data which is used to estimate non-auto driver mode share is journey to work data. There are surveys that are done, the American Community Survey, through just surveys that sometimes Park and Planning does, looking at trips going to and from locations. What the TMDs do now in Bethesda and Silver Spring, what they're reporting is journey to work data. You can come up with estimates as to what what all day NADMS is, but they're all based on factors. And so it's less tied to a real number. So that would be my, on NADMS, that would be one recommendation, is that we talk about it elsewhere, and in this metric, we're looking at journey to work. Both from residents, sorry, we'll keep picking on Clarksburg. Residents in Clarksburg, how do they get to work? Or employees in Clarksburg, how do they get to work in Clarksburg? And then just an associated point before we leave NADMS, rather than trying to measure whether a new plan is better than the old plan in NADMS, we've just established goals for every area. And instead of trying to measure what the improvement would be in the new plan, the plan itself should be developed so that it, when it goes through, running through the model, it produces that level, that non-auto driver mode share. So if in Clarksburg, the current plan, if you run the model, sorry, Clarksburg, it's just, we just keep using this as an example. If Clarksburg, the model says that the current plan at build out is 20%, and then a new plan for Clarksburg comes up and it would, according to the model, achieve 23%, it's not good enough because we've set the goal as being 25%. So amend that plan to bump that NADMS up to achieve 25%. The only other caveat is that when you're redoing a plan, there should be the option of being able to revise that NADMS goal. So if in fact you do a plan and it reaches 23% in the example I gave, but to get to 25% is unreasonable in terms of, you know, the land uses you'd have to change or the transit you'd have to change or whatever, then maybe the goal itself would change according to that master plan. But that's what that's what I would do with those two things with NADMS, which is to, again, it's journey to work and it's conform the plan to that goal, the preset goal, if at all possible.
All right. What other ways there to do it? Yeah, there's only one set of data. So any comments here, Eric, Jason?
Okay, I think that, well, I know that we would agree with that particular approach. You know, again, a lot of these recommendations were guided that we're making for this particular analysis. We're driven by what we've experienced for analysis we've done for Thrive. So in that context, we were looking at all day trips for NADMS, but looking at it for work trips in the context of the GIP is something that we could do, and we could support that.
Okay.
Any other comments on this before they have one more point, and then we're done?
So we're doing the work trips.
Yes.
Work trips, and again, rather than using this as a metric, it would just be, no, you get to that goal. You develop the plan that actually produces that percentage. The final point, if we're ready to move on, it has to do with the last metric that's proposed, the low stress bicycle accessibility metric. I guess my concern here is, and I think Gary mentioned it earlier, we do have the bicycle master plan, which was adopted 2 years ago. It says for every road what kind of bikeway there should be along it. It's basically already a master plan saying you should have a shared use path along this road, or a separated bike lane, or a conventional bike lane, or a shared use street, any one of a number of different classifications of bikeway. And since we're talking here only about what happens at build out, if you have a plan that already specifies what that is, why do we need, why do this? Why have this as a separate metric? It doesn't mean when you're doing redoing, again, the Clarksburg plan, you don't say, all right, well, we've thought about things since we last did the Clarksburg plan, last did the bikeway plan, and maybe this particular road ought to have a separated bike lane rather than a conventional bike lane. Fine, and you just make that change based on safety concerns, right-of-way concerns, all the things you normally look at. But to have sort of an overall metric for that area, to me, doesn't make I'm not quite sure what it does. So I guess I'm recommending not having that as a metric either.
All right, well, what's the harm here? I mean, I think it's important to keep it in view. So comments from planning as to council staff's recommendation?
Well, you know, with this, the bike accessibility metric is certainly something that we propose. We still support that. We still think it's important and should be considered. Again, because of the I think it's in keeping with the fact that we have our recently adopted bicycle master plan. And though I guess there is some, I guess from Glenn's perspective, in terms of his comments, there is some maybe a bit of redundancy in maybe using the bicycle metric in this context, given the fact that we do have a 80% goal and already identified in the bicycle master plan. But there may be some redundancy in that regard, but we still think this is an important metric to consider.
Yeah, and what I would add is that if a master plan were to propose a substantially different land use configuration than what was analyzed in the bicycle master plan, then it would really make sense to make sure we were performing this analysis again. So.
Yeah, I'm wouldn't fall on my sword on this one. The only other comment I would make is that it talks about making sure that 80% of the trips are done on a low stress network. My knowledge, we don't have a model, a travel demand model, which forecasts where bike trips are going. So I don't even know how we know that, or how we would forecast that. I mean,
well, I can't answer that specifically myself, but we clearly have that ability because we have that 80% number, because that's what that already is. That's an estimate of the bike trips that will occur at build out of the bicycle master plan countywide. So we and Eric may know, but we must have that ability because we've already come up with that number.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
So what this does basically is it says, does this plan significantly change the likely bike use from what is in the bike master plan or not? That's sort of what I'm hearing. Is that a fair way to think about it?
I think so. Yes.
So it's sort of like checking a box, consistent with the bike master plan or not?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Now, is this one that you would do based on comparing the old plan to the new plan within a planning area, or is this going back to looking at countywide for this particular metric?
The
80% was countywide, I thought.
It is countywide, Glenn. Yes.
But we do have policy area numbers as well.
Okay.
No, they may not be. They have not been updated to reflect the new policy areas because the policy areas changed with this new policy, right? So, but we can do it at that level as well.
Okay.
Good catch. Yeah. Okay. Any comments there, council members?
Consensus, it sounds like. I think we're all in agreement.
It sounds good to me.
Okay, I think that is it. I'll draft a memo. I'll run it by the three of you in the next day or two. And if you're okay with it, then we'll send it off to the chair.
I reserve the right to totally object when I see the memo, Dr. Orton. So just
Mr.
FYI.
Giorno, every council member always has that.
I was going to say, I always reserve the right to disagree when Dr. Orton sends a memo.
Oh, just when I send a memo. Okay, thank you very much.
I was more general, Glenn. It wasn't.
And I was going to say, and I also reserve the right to be wrong sometimes.
No, that's all right. So no, that's the point of sending it out to you, see if you agree with what I've written. Okay, Mr. Chair, I think that's all we've got this morning.
All right.
Great,
Enjoy
thanks.
for your work. Appreciate everyone's help here. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
La calidad y la cualidad de servicios la calidad y la cantidad de servicios que tenemos en el condado para nuestros